We actually have been doing virtual tours of the show, so that's happening, and you can check those out on the events page of the online exhibition. But this will be the first time that we are doing something that kind of a lecture that kind of relates to the content of the show. And yeah, what this allowed us the opportunity to do is to dig into the typefaces that relate to the Bauhaus in some way. So some of this information is in the catalog, which I highly recommend. It was an amazing piece of work. Some of it is in the online exhibition, some is in the show itself, but there's a lot here that kind of expands on that. So I'm glad you could join me. It's screen sharing time. Okay. Oh, let's see. It's actually been a while since I've done a talk. So. Is that working, Sarah?
Looks great.
Cool. So we're going to have three main categories here. We're going to talk about type used by the Bauhaus, type that is, by things that were published by the Bauhaus and students and masters of the school, and the actual typefaces they used. Then we'll look at type that was inspired by the Bauhaus. So these are typefaces that either directly or indirectly have some relationship to the pedagogy of the school or the kinds of design that the school pioneered. And then we'll talk about type simply called Bauhaus. And why this last category? Well, because of this kind of stuff. This may look fine to you, but by the time we finish with the hour, hopefully you'll understand why I would hope for a better typeface choice for this cover or for this TV series, which I believe is produced by the BBC or another UK channel. Looks like a really great dramatization of the Bauhaus, but again, not the type I would choose for the logo. And even worse, Bauhausstrasse. This is Bauhaus Street 2 in Dessau, I believe, using a typeface that is called Bauhaus, but really has very minimal relationships to the school itself. So let's get into type that was actually used by students and masters at the Bauhaus. This first one is not a Bauhaus publication, but it was produced by, it's authored by Johannes Itten, who was an early teacher at the school. And the cover was done by Margit Terry Adler, who did this amazing lettering. And then the typesetting was done by Friedel Dicker. And this piece is such a wonder in many different ways. And it's one of my favorite items in the show. And I think you'll agree why. It contains a section of reproductions of classical paintings that are accompanied by lithograph reproductions of Itten's commentary. And so here you see Itten's crazy lettering, all sorts of sketches and decoration, and commentary on these classical paintings. It's wild, it's chaotic, and it's the kind of stuff that you probably wouldn't see much of until the punk and grunge movements that would happen much later in the 20th century. But it's not just Itten's piece. This is a collaborative work. So you have Terry Adler, who was the wife of the book's publisher, who did the cover. And then you also have Friedel Dicker, who was a student of Itten's, rendering one of his essays into typographic compositions. And this is just an amazing feat, because what she's doing is taking these improvisational sketches and lettering, and she is transforming them on the letterpress with metal type. Those of you who've ever set metal type will understand the effort that's required to make this work. And they come to look like Dada-esque compositions. And she may have been inspired by Dada publications, but from what I can tell, she's really just doing her best to translate what Itten was doing with drawings and lettering into metal type and letterpress forms. The Weimar print shop, the school was at Weimar at this point. They had no letterpress facilities yet, not until they moved to Dessau. So she's typesetting this work elsewhere. And like I said, you can imagine how much effort's required. It was meticulous labor. There's a quote in the catalog of Dicker writing to her friend Annie Votitz in 1920 or 1921, saying, "I typeset an essay from Itten for 2 weeks, and I am so weak I can scarcely say when I can come from there." 2 days later. Today I set 6 Itten pages. I'm actually amazed that she did that many in one day. It shows her talent, and she went on to do incredible work, which she'll talk about in a moment. But what's interesting here is that the typefaces that are being used for a lot of us when we're first introduced to the Bauhaus, we're not thinking about this kind of type. This was, a lot of it feels kind of antique, feels kind of old school. It doesn't seem that modern. The way it's being set is very modern, but what she's doing is using type that is just available at the time. But before I get into that, I wanted to say a little bit more about her amazing biography. She left the Bauhaus in 1923 and worked as an artist and a designer. And of course, she was one of many who were imprisoned by the Nazis. And in 1943 and to 44, she taught art to children at the Theresienstadt ghetto and concentration camp. And this pretty much became a pioneering method of art therapy. And I have a book actually in my library called I Never Saw Another Butterfly. It's something I had since I was a kid, and it's filled with art from children at this ghetto. And I didn't realize until now that she was the teacher who compiled these pieces together and taught the children. And the exercises that she conducted included collages by old masters, paintings, as well as rhythmic and observational drawing. And among the students of hers that survived, several became founders of the new disciplines of art therapy and child psychology. So this is a Bauhaus legacy that is often overlooked, not only a woman's contribution, but also how it influenced these other disciplines of art therapy. Another amazing composition. And we're going to look at this one as we look at the typefaces that are used. The whole piece, despite how chaotic it looks and how varied the type appears, uses just these 5 typefaces, as far as I could tell. And thanks to Florian Hardvig, who helped me identify these for for the book when we were adding that context to the catalog. But what you're seeing here are essentially typefaces that were just widely available at the time. Ungerfrachter was a fairly common Frachter typeface. As a lot of you will know, this is the traditional text type of Germany at that time. It wasn't until midway through the 20s and Bauhaus's influence and the new typography influence that we started to get more Roman serifs as texts, most in Germany. Most of it was set in Frachter type. So Ungerfrachter was used for a lot of the lighter decorative type here. Fette Gotisch is a typeface that many of you may know, maybe not as well as Fette Frachter, that was also released by the Bauer Foundry. But again, a widely available typeface towards the end of the 19th century. Here's a specimen from the archive. Everything I'm going to show you today are specimens in our collection, and most of them are images that are shot with our hi-fi photography that you can see in the online archive. And some of the specimens are there in the online archive as well. So here's a Gensch and Hase specimen. We have a lot of specimens from this foundry in the online archive so far, and it's showing Fette Frachter and Fette Gotisch. Fette Gotisch is very similar. It's a heavy, bold black letter, but it's a little bit more straight-sided than Fette Frachter. And it's interesting to look at these specimens in terms of how the type would traditionally be set. Even the way that the foundry in 1935 was advertising it, much after this piece was produced by Dicker. They're showing it in a very traditional form with centered layouts, with this kind of ornamental decoration. This is traditionally how you would see a typeface like Fette Gotisch at that time. Normand was a really popular, what we would call a fat face style that came about in the 19th century. It's kind of a takeoff of earlier German fat faces. And this is essentially what happened in the Industrial Revolution as they started to add more and more weight to the Didon style typefaces or modern typefaces of that time, adding more and more weight so that they could become really striking display faces. So here's a specimen of Normand, continued to be very popular up until the mid 20th century. Close-up of the character set. A lot of you may know Poster Bedoni, but this one has a very German origin. Has kind of a square form. You look at the A and the G, those kind of flat sides. And then Bernhard Antiqua. This was, Lucian Bernhard was by that time quite well known as a poster designer. And this style, he went on to create many typefaces, but this typeface really emulates a lot of his lettering style that you would see in his posters and advertising. This kind of rough hewn, wobbly edged Roman serif with a lot of weight to it. And here's a specimen from 24, about the same time that this sticker piece was produced. And you can see this is the extra feta, which means extra bold weight of Bernhard Antiqua. There were many styles released. And in the specimens, those of you who aren't familiar with them, these are what we call waterfall specimen, where they're showing every size of the typeface that was available. And then you see what I presume to be Bernhard's designs, because they feel like his work. showing you the kind of type that they intend, type of design that they intended this typeface to be used in. So again, you see centered layouts, but maybe a little bit more modern illustration, but it's still kind of this arts and crafts or kind of secessionist style of illustration. And again, some really beautiful layouts, lots of color, a little bit more modern, but nothing like what was going on at the Bauhaus. This next one, we won't go through and identify every typeface because there's so many of them, but it's another example of a master or a professor at the school creating something unique, a personal project on their own. This is Felix Klay's work. He sent this letter to the German dancer Carla Grosch in 1927. We assume in celebration of her teaching appointment at the Bauhaus. And it consists of 5 pages of dynamic pictorial and text collage laid over watercolor backgrounds of intersecting lines and planes. So it's an incredible book. It's a one of a kind. We're really fortunate to have it at the archive. And I assume what it's doing here is combining typeset texts, maybe his own type that he's set himself, but mostly with elements found in books and newspapers and other kinds of ephemera. And so there's all sorts of type being used here that was common at the time. And it's a good example of this early style of expressive typography that was going on at the Bauhaus before the kinds of more straight-laced gridded approach that we associate with it. And it's a great record of what kinds of typefaces were being used at the time. Again, he's taking these things that were widely available, widely seen, like Herald or another Bernhard typeface, Bernhard cursive, Tages Antiqua, which is a very similar kind of a wobbly Roman, Altfrachter, Block Frachter, and Block itself. That sans serif there on the right side. And he's taking all of these kind of traditional or antique typefaces and giving them a modern feel just in the arrangement. But let's get into some official publications of the Bauhaus. I highly recommend checking out the online exhibition and watching the 2 videos that Henry Cole Smith produced, talking through what makes this magazine unique and how it is, what the goals of the typography were. It was designed, at least this first year was designed by Moholy Nagy, who was the first typographic master of the school. And a key element is everything is in lowercase. So this is something a lot of you may know, that they were championing a simplification of typography, and that meant just removing all the uppercase letters. And the typefaces that are being used are unique for the time. Again, no heavy Frachter being used for text. There's a serif here for text, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then a lot of sans serifs, a lot of what were called grotesques at the time. And then later on, the second year, Just Schmidt took over as the typographic, or it's not the second year, but in 1928, third year. And he's using the same nameplate here, but making it feel slightly different by just reducing the extenders of the B and the H. You can see that modification there, adding a new modern twist on it. But let's look at some of the typefaces that are being used. Again, if you look at these release dates, most of them had been around for at least 10, 20 years when the Bauhaus started using them. So a lot of this has to do with what's available in the shop, what's available to purchase, not what is, absolutely new and fresh, at least at this time. It's really just about how it's being used. So the first typeface, Breite Grotesque, this is kind of a generic name. It just means wide grotesque. It's not that wide, actually. It's maybe responding to the fact that a lot of these sans serifs at the time were condensed kind of headline work or jobbing typefaces that were narrower than this one. But Schelter and Giesecke released this in the 1890s. And there were eventually 3 different weights. So you'll often see it as Breite Halbfette, which is what you're seeing here, which means half bold or semi-bold. But that generally is called medium these days. And then Breite Magere, which would refer, oh, yes, my local German here is going to pronounce it for me.
Magere.
Magere, thank you. Breite Magere Grotesque, which is the lightweight. And then Breite Fette Grotesque, which is the bold. So here's a specimen of Breite Grotesque. It really became kind of the signature typeface of the Bauhaus, especially in the official publications. It's this very straightforward, plain-spoken, utilitarian grotesque, and it and others like it really were the most popular typefaces for the school throughout its run. So here are those 3 weights that I mentioned. This is from a specimen around the same time or a little bit earlier from Schelter and Giesecke, showing those 3 styles about the same time as the Bauhaus was founded. You can see on the extra heavy weights that it just gets a lot wider, because unlike a lot of sans serifs that were created afterwards as systems, this one just continues to maintain that shape. And so in order to have as much interior space as possible, you've got to stretch it out and make it wider. So that A with the tail, that E, everything is broader so that it can keep that weight, but also have interior space in the counters. And one of the most iconic uses of Breite Grotesque is this set of inflation currency by Herbert Bayer, one of the masters at the school in 1923. When he designed these, he was only 23 years old, still a student at the Bauhaus. And the state commissioned this Notgeld, or emergency money. And these astronomical denominations are reflecting the hyperinflation crisis that was going on in Germany after World War I. These were designed nearly overnight for immediate printing, and basically just relied on the only type that was available at the press. And so it's a really great example of how necessity bred creativity, bred something entirely new. They're so different than a lot of the Notgeld, which we have in the collection actually at the archive at that time, which every region had their own style, and mostly it was used lettering. It was very illustrative, lots of ornamentation. But what Bayer's doing here is just purely typographic. There's one little kind of official Weimar illustration in the bottom left, but otherwise it's all about type. And so since Breite Grotesque is such an important part of the visual language of the Bauhaus, I wanted to mention a few digital revivals, and I'll do this throughout the rest of the presentation for some other key typefaces. But I think the most complete and faithful to the original is FF Bau, designed by Christian Schwartz in 2002. And that's the typeface that we're using in all of our material for the signage in the show, for the catalog, for the online archive, and for some of the slides I'm showing you. Not online archive, the online exhibition. F Grotesque, designed by Radim Peshko, Czech designer. It is a little bit more loose interpretation, not as many styles, but another direction you could go. And then Sona, which was designed by Chris Sowersby in New Zealand, is actually more of a takeoff on Accidens Grotesque, which was another typeface used by the school, but it has some elements of Writer Grotesque in it, and highly recommend you checking that one out. And also check out Clem's website, where there's some really great in-depth historical information written by him and Dan Reynolds about Accidens Grotesque and these other utilitarian sans serifs that were common at the time. So here's just an example of FF Bau in use for the catalog. And it beautifully sets the tone for doing exactly what the Bauhaus did with their typography, which was just convey the message and let the work come to the fore and get the attention. Here's another interior page. You'll see that James Williams, who designed the catalog, is making some real judicious use of the weights of Bau and these rules, these thick and thin rules that were commonly used in the Bauhaus. Aurora, another typeface that you'll see a lot in Bauhaus publications, including the magazine. This particular weight is the wide, the bold wide that you see underneath the nameplate there, where it says Stadt einer Vorrede. And Aurora was a massive family of at the time. You know, most typefaces were released one bit at a time, and usually they weren't larger than maybe 4 or 5 styles. But Aurora was a very early example of almost what we would call a super family, multiple weights and widths. And it was very popular, went on to be copied, or there were formal agreements with other foundries to release it on their own. So on the left, you see a specimen from C.E. Weber, and then on the right from Schriftguss. And it is, it was such a large family that there were all sorts of different ways of naming it. So Schriftguss, for example, was calling it by various planets. So they just called the family Grotesque, but each style was a planet: Saturn, Jupiter, Neptune, Uranus. And Weber and some of the others, we use numbers to and weight names to specify each style. But what's unique about Aurora Grotesque is that it was designed by a firm called Wagner and Schmidt, that they designed typefaces. They didn't produce them. They would create, maybe they created matrices, I have to confirm that, but their whole goal was to create new designs and then license them to foundries. And that's one of the reasons this was available from so many different foundries. What you're seeing here is a Weber specimen that's just a single fold-out sheet showing all of those styles with Roman numerals as different style names. And one of many, many specimens of Aurora that we have at the archive. One of the other names for it is Neue Modern Grotesque. And here are some digital revivals. Just this last year, Stefan Muller designed for Forgotten Shapes, a fairly new foundry, a pretty faithful revival of Neue Modern Grotesque. And then just this year, CJ Dunn, after doing a lot of research at the archive, actually released Pennypacker, which is more of a redrawing or a homage to the design, but adds a lot to it, adds a lot of styles to it, which I'll show you in a minute. Dada Grotesque from the Swiss designers at Optimo came out in 2005, and that is a takeoff on a particular style of Aurora Grotesque. There were many, many updates and variations on it over time. And if you go to Fonts in Use, for example, and look up Aurora, you'll see the complexity of not just the size of the family, but the multiple revisions of it over time. Also highly recommend checking out Indra Kupferschmidt's blog and her talk about this, which I believe was given at either Typographics or Robothon, but you can find the video online. Super interesting story about just a single typeface family and its evolution over time. And then Scout, similar to Dada Grotesque, is taking on the simplified version of the typeface released by Cyrus Highsmith in 2008. But I just want to show you a little bit more of Pennypacker because it demonstrates just how far you can go with digital reinterpretation of Aurora. Here he's added other widths to it, so more than just 2 widths, you have 5 and some more weights. And he's also kept some of these revisions that I've just mentioned that happened over time with typefaces like Normala Grotesque or Normal Grotesque, a great name. Some of these revisions are incorporated as stylistic alternates. So if you look at border and drafting here, you'll see that you can choose multiple styles of A, F, and R and G. Another typeface being used in the magazine, Console. This is the one you see right below Bauhaus in that second year issue there at the bottom. Console is a really interesting typeface that actually I don't believe has been digitally revived, but it has a lot of interesting potential. Here's a specimen at the archive from the Vollmer foundry that released Console. And it has 2 basically subfamilies. On the left, you see the fairly straightforward utilitarian sans serif. Some key characters that are kind of different than other grotesques we've looked at are that F with the kind of shepherd's hook top to it, and the A, the shape of the A with the flat top and the big bowl. But then on the right, you see another kind of style within the same family that has more of an Art Nouveau flair to it, or Vienna Secession flair. And it's interesting that you could kind of combine these two because they have the same weight, the same body size, to get, as these were, basically alternates to get more of a expressive look to them. But you wouldn't expect to see the one on the right in the Bauhaus work that was really trying to be much more straightforward in the typographic approach. And then Alt Medieval, like the Bernhard Antiqua, this is kind of a throwback to rough printing of the arts and crafts era. And the style itself is called medieval because it's actually going back to some of the earlier forms of Roman serif. But a really cool design. It has some nice style to it with that serif on the top of the A and the diamond shaped punctuation. This is another one that has no official digital revival. I think it's worth checking out. I love the counter of the lowercase a that's kind of circular. and just the readability of it overall, despite how expressive it is, I think is great. But again, this is something that the Bauhaus would have chosen because it was available, not necessarily because it suited their design sensibilities. And it's one indication of that is that it wasn't used for very long. A lot of these were used, a lot of these kind of Roman serifs were used in the first few issues of the magazine, but then they went to sans serifs. And this is just a little break from Bauhaus publications to a Bauhaus advertisement. This appeared in Die Tapete, which I believe means wallpaper. Yeah. So this was a home design magazine or a housewares magazine. And one of the early products that was produced by the Bauhaus was wallpaper. And so this is not an official Bauhaus advertisement, but it is a distributor of the Bauhaus wallpaper, advertising in a very typical Bauhaus style, with all lowercase, the asymmetrical layout, and using a typeface called Venus, which was another popular grotesque used at the school. What's kind of interesting, though, is it's using those of you who know the typeface Venus may not recognize this odd open bold G. This was an alternate that was available in the typeface. You can see, well, actually, I think that's Accidents Grotesque below, but the standard Venus G was that what we call a monocular or single story G down, where it says Grundsätze. Another Bauhaus publication series was the Bauhaus Bücher, and these were more permanent showcases of the pedagogy and the concepts that were being developed at the school. This first book, these were all designed primarily, or at least art directed, by Moholy-Nagy. This first issue was anyway. The jacket, though, on the left was designed by the Hungarian student Farkas Molnar. And what you see used here are Breite Grotesque again. And you can see how nice this Halbfette weight, this kind of medium or semi-bold weight works for the embossed cover of the book. The title page here is using another new wide typeface that I'll show you in a moment. We start to see those elements that become very typical of Bauhaus typography, the large circles, the heavy lines or rules, and again, the asymmetrical layouts. So this wide typeface is used in a lot of the Bauhaus Bücher, and it is Industria, which is a typeface that didn't have multiple widths. It was all wide, but there were multiple weights of it. And it was released about 10 years before the Bauhaus. And so added another kind of width to the palette for these grotesque layouts. And here is a specimen of Industria from our collection. There are really a lot of beautiful specimens from the Gersh foundry, and this is a nice one. But again, I want you to think about the way that it's being displayed here, with the ornamentation, with the type filling the entire page without any white space. This is not how the Bauhaus would use it. This is how they expected it to be used at the time in 1910. But you'll see that the way that the Bauhaus used it is quite different. The other typeface that you see at the bottom here looks a lot like Accidents Grotesque, which we've mentioned before, but it's actually a predecessor called Grotesque #1. And this is the first typeface that we're seeing here that is not originating in Germany. Most of the, if not all the other typefaces, were German typefaces that we've looked at. But this was probably designed at the Miller and Richard foundry in Scotland. And around 1870, so it's a fairly early sans serif. So on the left here, you see a specimen from Miller and Richard. You can see the lowercase has a little bit more calligraphic nature to it than a lot of these other grotesques that we were looking at. And then on the right, you see the German import from Vollmer, or one of the German imports, and essentially the same typeface, just as from a German foundry. But one little interesting side note about this typeface is that it was used in the first book that was composed entirely of upper and lowercase sans serif types. This is 1900. Peter Behrens, a pretty pioneering designer in Germany, not part of the Bauhaus, of course, is before the Bauhaus, but it's kind of presaging the experimentation with sans serif type that the Bauhaus then participated in. And it's the first example of that, in using that grotesque from Miller and Richard. Not sure what's going on with the spacing on the S and the T and post in there, but a beautiful book. Back to the Bauhaus Booker. This is book number 8, 1925. And you see here, they're still using antiquas or Roman serif typefaces for the text. And this antiqua is called Gensch antiqua, and it's recently, there wasn't any digital revival of this until recently, but the Lazy Dogs Foundry has produced one that I think we'll be using in a publication coming up soon, so I'm excited about that. But it's a lovely, sharp Roman serif. So as opposed to the alt medieval that we saw before, it's got a similar structure to it. Has that kind of Renaissance era old style serif, but it's sharper. It doesn't have those wobbly contours. And then at the bottom, you see Industria being used again. Here's a beautiful specimen. We have several on the online archive of Gensch Antiqua. And what's interesting about this one is this is from about 1927. And so I'm assuming they're responding to its use by the Bauhaus. And so they've, if you look at some of the earlier specimens of the typeface when it was released around 1910, they're pretty traditional, they're pretty conventional. But here you're seeing some unusual compositions, and you're seeing even a direct reference to Walter Gropius there at the bottom and Bauhaus architecture. And then this awesome illustration created with metal ornaments and rules. I tried to look up Professor Eichers. I don't know if he was a Bauhaus professor or if this is just a made-up name, but again, you can see direct references to the kind of symbols and ornaments that were used by the Bauhaus, these geometric triangles, circles, and squares. And here's another kind of related Bauhaus publication, but not produced at the Bauhaus. These are Walter Dexel's invitations, announcements to shows that were featuring Bauhaus students and artists that are related to the Bauhaus. This is a really nice collection of pure typographic design. Other than the rules, there's only type going on here, and yet they're very striking. And especially for the time, I imagine that they were unusual in the composition and the fact that no illustrations were used. And then we're really fortunate on the right to have a maquette. So that's the layout, the original artwork for a poster, also produced by Dexel for the Vienna gallery, which was near Weimar, I believe. Do you know where Jena is?
Yeah,
German.
it's on the way to Berlin.
Yes, it's similar, it's in that area. So yeah, what you're seeing here on the right is pasted up strips of text. And the typeface that Dexel loved is, it looks, similar maybe to Venus or Accidens Grotesque, but it's actually a single style typeface called Blockschrift from Gensch again, or Gensch and Hase it became later on, but when it was released in 1897, it was the Gensch foundry. And I actually really love this one. It's not very well known, but it has a lot of similarities to the Breite Grotesque, but it's even more kind of just basic. It just kind of looks the way that you would expect letters to look if you were to describe them to a child. And it came also in what's called a Lichthe, or a open face style there on the left. It also came in a swash variation called Botha or Botha. You can see all of those alternates there in the zoomed image there on the right. This kind of modification to sans serifs was fairly popular in the UK and France and the US around the mid to late 19th century. There, you often will find these grotesques with some flair added to them, just extending the strokes and adding a little swash to them. Of course, you would never see the Bauhaus use this particular style of Blockschrift. Here is the rest of that specimen I showed you before of Blockschrift, and I think it's a beautiful example of a type foundry that is responding to Bauhaus typography. So like I showed you before, a lot of the typefaces that were being used by the Bauhaus were advertised by foundries in a more conventional design, a more traditional way. But this specimen is now obviously saying, okay, we know what's going on. Everybody's moving to this new typography that's promoted by the Bauhaus and folks like Jan Schickhold. And so let's create a specimen that is specializing in that. So this is Schriften zur modernen Typographie, which means type for modern typography. And the entire specimen is just filled with grotesques, a lot of different varieties, but all in the same kind of utilitarian style. And this one, Monument, is similar to Venus, which we've mentioned earlier, but without the angled E's and F's. If you know Venus, you know that the ends of the strokes have these kind of angles to them. So they've kind of simplified it here and made it a little bit more basic, so it feels more like Shelter and Giesecke's Grotesque or Blockschrift. And they released it in multiple weights and widths. So something like Aurora, you had a kind of large family. Each of these is actually both given a name of the weight and width, but also a number. So Monument 33 at the top and 32 at the top. It also has a lot more contrast than a lot of these other simplified grotesques, especially this bright fet, or bold, extended. But here you see some more of that kind of geometric ornamentation being used for illustration. So they're responding directly to what's going on with Bauhaus typography and showing you, okay, you want a grotesque that can give you that look. Here it is. Here is Monument. And the ornaments to go with it. Some more layouts that are clearly inspired by either the Bauhaus or other new typography design. And you see there on the right, Cartolina 1 and 2, those are kind of takeoffs on earlier grotesques. But again, what they're doing, these are probably 19th century grotesques, but they're putting them in this specimen book to say, look, we've got a full range of typefaces for your new typography style. So now let's look at some typefaces that were inspired by the Bauhaus. And we're going to start with one that is often associated with the Bauhaus, but its designer did not attend the school, was not teaching at the school. And in fact, the connections to the Bauhaus are fairly tenuous, but what it is the most successful response to the ideals of Bauhaus design: geometry, simplicity. And I've got a video here that actually didn't optimize for video, Sarah, so let me know if it doesn't sound right. But I'm going to play a video that is actually available on the online exhibition, and let me know if it sounds.
We're looking at the first specimen of Futura, designed by Paul Renner, issued by the Bauer Type Foundry in 1927. We're looking at the first specimen of Futura. We're looking at the first specimen of Futura.
Sorry.
We're looking at the first specimen of Futura, designed by Paul Renner, issued by the Bauer Type Foundry in 1927. This specimen includes a series of booklets.
Oh, it doesn't seem to be playing. Hold on, I will share again.
It was playing.
Oh, was it? Oh,
Yeah.
that's funny, because it wasn't playing on my screen.
Very weird.
Okay, well, I'm gonna. Was the sound playing?
Yeah,
Oh.
it was a little tinny, but it was fine.
Okay, well, we'll go again.
We are looking at the first specimen of Futura, designed by Paul Renner, issued by the Bauer Type Foundry in 1927. This specimen includes
Well, actually,
a series of booklets. We're looking at the first.
it's not actually moving from what I can tell. So, yeah, that's all right. The nice thing about this is that you can watch it on the online archive. You may have been hearing the sound, but you should have seen the specimen open. If you didn't see it open, then it wasn't.
Yeah, I'll find a link to it. I'll post it.
Thank you.
We are looking at the first specimen of Futura.
You're probably done hearing me say that over and over. But what you'll see if you watch the video is Paul Renner's experimentation with simplification of letter forms. So not only is the main part of the alphabet based on the circle and sharp points of the triangle and straight lines, but there are also attempts to take the more complicated lowercase letters and rope them into these geometric forms. So here's a character set that includes some of these early experiments. They're highlighted here that were pretty radical for the time, but some of them actually work pretty well in text. And this is one of our favorite things to show to guests when they come for a tour at the archive, is to have them look at this first specimen of Futura and read the text and see if they notice any unusual character shapes. And until you zoom in, you actually they don't really stand out to you. But if you look at the M and the N and their square form, and then the R, which is just a ball and a stick, these were all part of that original character set and actually read very well as text. And it kind of shows that there's a little bit more flexibility, at least with our eyes today, in what we can do with text typefaces and still have them be legible, as long as they're designed in a way that the rhythm works, that the weight is even. There's a lot of flexibility in character shape. Now, Futura it may not have been even used once, at least the basic styles by Bauhaus typographers. There may be something here or there that isn't well known. But Futura Black, which was a stencil variation in the family that came along 1929, was used right away by Moholy-Nagy for the 12th Bauhaus book. The typeface had just come out, so there's a little bit of debate about whether this is hand lettered for the cover here, or if it's actually using the type itself. But it is Futura Black. It's directly from the typeface, as you can see from this specimen here. And one of the things to note about Futura is that it had at least 4 different styles that are kind of unrelated, at least in their structure, but they were given the Futura name because it was such a popular product that it just made sense for anything that Renner came out with to be given the same name. It's kind of like the expanding the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You want to continue to use the names that have already been big box office hits. So Futura Black, it does have more direct relevance to the Bauhaus because it's using these kind of modular stencil letter shapes that were common in experiments by participants at the school, which we'll see later. Here's there's kind of a trio of geometric sans serifs that came out in 1926 and 7, all about the same time. There's a lot of debate about whether Airbar Grotesque or Futura was designed first. There were sketches being done by the 2 designers around the same time, but Airbar actually came out, was released by Ludwig and Meyer before Futura was released. So even though Futura is more popular today or more well-known today, Airbar Grotesque hit the market first. And like Futura, it was experimenting with this geometry in the sans serif form. And like Futura, it used classical Roman capital proportions. So if you look at automobile, for example, the O's are very wide, the M is very wide, but the E and the U are very narrow. This is all coming directly from the classical Roman inscriptions. Yet the bones, the structure, or the skin of the typeface itself is very minimal. A little bit different than Futura. What's interesting about Airbar Grotesque is that it was offered in multiple X heights. So you could get it with a very low X height, as you see there on the right, which was called the Zweite, or 2, or second. And then Erste on the left has a slightly larger X height. And then there's the Bold, which has a very unique look to it. It departs more from the lighter weights than Futura's Bold does. Here you see it being used in a kind of Bauhaus style with these heavy rules, but again, the whole page is being filled. As Grendel would say, horror vacui, going all back to the Middle Ages, they were afraid of white space. But a little bit later, you see them starting to promote the typeface in totally inspired by new typography, with the big round circle with the asymmetrical layout and just the spare composition. And then a little bit later, this ring-bound specimen, which directly references the square, circle, and triangle. You'll see this, these elements, obviously in the Bauhaus work itself, but also in many type specimens that are referencing the Bauhaus. So there are a lot of Futura specimens that use the shapes to promote the typeface's geometric form. You also see these references to, all sorts of design and art and architecture being modernized. We should abandon the old ways. We should abandon Fraktur, as you see there at the bottom left, and go to the new type without calligraphy. It says keine calligraphy. Then the third geometric typeface that came out, that was released about the same time, was Cobble. And this is departs quite a bit from the other two because its designer, Rudolf Koch, was a very skilled calligrapher. And so this was a big departure from what he would normally be doing. And you can see the calligraphy in the shapes. You can see the angled ends of the letter shapes. So that kind of abandons that spare geometric form a little bit, but there still are the circles, there still is the proportions that you saw in the other two typefaces. And you see them advertising it as a purely modern typeface. The other interesting thing about Cobble, and most people don't see that these version today because I don't think they're available digital, but it was offered in these with these alternate round capitals and other round shapes, as you can see down there in the lowercase. So again, making even more direct relationship to geometry, although I feel like this becomes more Art Deco than it is modernist in terms of the Bauhaus or new typography style. And that's kind of a distinction that you'll see a lot in the stuff we're looking at is this more Art Deco? Is it more Bauhaus? Art Deco tends to be a little bit more decorative rather than spare and plain spoken. So now we're going to venture into what a lot of us associate with the Bauhaus, which is Herbert Bayer's experiments, alphabetic experiments. This is a piece that's actually not in the show, but it is in the online archive. Actually, it might be in the show, but it's not in the catalog. But anyway, it came late, and we're really lucky to have it. It is an original paste up of one of Bayer's experiments, and there were many of these in various styles that he produced over a 2 or 3 year period. But it's a real treasure for us at the archive. You see the corrections, the additions of some of the letters, the shortening of the ascenders on the D, the 3 weights being represented with those 2 Ds, the alternate A, and then a replacement of the S, whatever S was being used before. And you'll see some other styles of S that Bayer played with. Here he's gone to a more square form. So here's another version that was actually advertised in Offset magazine in 1926. So you can see him going a little bit more round with the forms, a little bit more straightforward with that G, and experimenting with kind of some unicase style with that T. It feels more like an uppercase T. So one thing to know about Bayer's experiments is they were not released as typefaces. And that's something that's can be confusing because there are many typefaces inspired by his experiments. And there were many students and teachers who were producing these alphabets that were attempts to simplify the alphabet. They were drawn on large boards or other sketches or school assignments, but they were not produced as type that other people could use. That said, they did make their way into use in other ways. So here's Herbert Bayer designing a nameplate or logo for Die Neue Linie, which it was a women's magazine. And you can see variations of his universal type experiments on these issues. And in fact, on the yellow one, the September 1935, you can see even more of those letter shapes being put to work that are even more geometric. He used kind of a condensed version of it and that square S that we saw before in this catalog. So even though it's not a metal typeface, it was a kind of a model of lettering that he and other designers used in some of their work. So can we get it as a typeface now? Yes, you can get one, or actually there are multiple variations from different foundries. This is the first one that was directly a revival that was released in 1996 by P22. So you can see it's actually very close to the board that we have. There's just some slight variations in there, but otherwise this is very close to his original design. He also had a more condensed design that the Foundry types revived, David Quay and Frida Sack in the UK in 1996. Part of their Archetype series, which included lots of Bauhaus masters and other modernist designers. Their typefaces translated in, or their experiments translated into fonts. Joseph Albers had his own experiment, like many did. Just Schmidt had a similar design, which was taking modular shapes. So with the geometric type we saw before, you're thinking mostly about the outlines of the letter forms, but here the shapes themselves are modules, and essentially making a stencil alphabet, which is what this is called in the variation that appeared in Offset magazine. And the interesting thing about his system is that it had, as you see at the top here with these cut paper elements, there were different lengths. And so P22, when they released their version, they did the same thing. They offered it in various, these various elements so that you could essentially get more condensed weights based on which elements were used. Here's another typeface directly influenced by the Bauhaus. It is used by the Typotones foundry, one of my favorite foundries. I think there was a little error made here though, because it was intended to be inspired by Just Schmidt's work. And some of Schmidt's work was similar to this, but the poster that they're referencing is this poster here by Franz Ehrlich. So not a Just Schmidt design, but again, taking these ideas of geometry in a condensed letter form. And then one of my favorites and something that we've been using for the Bauhaus show is Yoshmi, which is kind of a portmanteau of Just Schmidt by Flavia Zimbardi, the Brazilian designer who is a graduate at Type at Cooper. And she took these very basic letters similar to the ones we saw before from Albers in these stencil elements, and made a very flexible and beautiful typeface for Adobe series, which has a bunch of other typefaces inspired by the Bauhaus. And we're using Yoshmi for the graphics in the show. So here's a little look in at the gallery. And for the large B on the cover of the catalog for the Bauhaus postcards, it really does the job beautifully at representing this whole idea of modular type that the Bauhaus experiments promoted. And then lastly, as far as digital revivals, this set by Gobor Kothe, who is a Hungarian designer, was released by Fountain in 2002. And he wanted to commemorate other Hungarian designers. There were many at the Bauhaus, including the furniture designer Breuer, Moholy-Nagy, of course, Molnar, Kosik, and so he's obviously also referencing Paul Renner's alternates there. But this is kind of a loose interpretation of some of these things we saw before as a full family. One typeface that actually was produced by a Bauhaus master was Herbert Bayer's Bayer type. He finally got to take his ideals of universal type that he did before as a sans serif, and he had one experiment as a serif, and turn them into something that you could use as a font. This was released in 1933 by the Berthold Foundry, and we have the specimen in the show, and it's also in the online exhibition. And it does have serifs. It's playing off of his early serif experiment of universal type. It also has uppercase letters, which I'm sure was abhorrent to Bayer that he had to use those because he was anti-caps. but that's something you had to do if you wanted a commercial success as a typeface. It also just abandons calligraphy altogether. It's doing something that's kind of like a Didot, but it's even more geometric than a Didot, no calligraphy at all. And that kind of goes to Bayer's ethic as a non-calligraphic designer. And you can see the simple geometric forms demonstrated by the grid here of the A. And he's comparing it to some of the antiquas that we noticed in use before. That one at the top, you may look familiar to you. That's Ultimate Evil. Here's the character set. It was available in 2 weights, and we have another large specimen at the archive I didn't get a chance to show you, but it's has a lot of beautiful samples of fire type in use, something I hope we can get digitized soon. And it wasn't nearly as popular at Typeface as Futura, of course, but it did see some use, and he used it himself, Bayer did, for this catalog here. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with this last category. That's what we looked at some examples of at the very beginning of the presentation. We're going to look again at this board from Herbert Bayer and think about what this might have inspired in the late 1960s. Now, I don't know if it was because it was maybe the 50th anniversary or getting close to the 50th anniversary of the Bauhaus, but there was an explosion of phototype and rub down lettering type that was inspired by this. And for a long time, it was believed to have started with this ridiculous ad for a diet solution called Metrical. The little caption says, "Our photographer said, since Metrical is a complete meal, let's shoot it like one." So this odd pink liquid was a diet product. And Ed Bengat, very prolific type designer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. He was assigned by Doyle, Dane, and Bernbach, the famous ad agency in New York, to create this essentially a custom typeface for multiple ads to be used by the company. And it was so popular, this, as it appeared in this ad, that Aaron Burns, who was really a brilliant marketing guy at International Typeface Company and photo lettering before that, he said, let's make it into a typeface. And so the first kind of edition of it was called Bauhaus Geometric and Bauhaus Alpha. And this is a specimen that was published in 1970 and called Art Deco, which again, kind of was mentioning this kind of crossover between Bauhaus styles and Deco styles. But Photo Lettering released a bunch of weights of this, and they say at the bottom there, first in Deco types, first in Photo Lettering Bauhaus revival. I think they were recognizing, as you'll see later, that there were just a deluge of Bauhaus styled revivals at this time, and they wanted to say they're the first. And in that same specimen, what Ed Bengat did and what Photo Lettering did was just blow up every popular typeface style to every variation they can imagine. And in this one, they're kind of doing a takeoff on Rudolf Koch's Prisma and applying it to the Bauhaus typeface. So all these multiple lines and combinations of the concentric lines. And that's what you see on the cover of the specimen there on the left as well. But they were not the first as much as they wanted to claim to be. The first may have been Burko by David Burke, a Chicago designer. This is a trifold leaflet from the Headliners Company, a competitor to Photo Lettering. And it was published in 1969, the specimen was, but as you'll see later, they say that Berko was actually released in 1967. But you can see the funny style names they have for Berko. Super Duper, Corpo, Funko. So it's taking Bauhaus and funking it up, essentially, because we're here in the late 60s now. And that's why this starts to feel very different from what was going on at the Bauhaus itself. But it's a very beautiful specimen, actually. I love that it's all printed on this angle, this kind of 30-degree angle. And here you see in the description that Berko Bold was designed in October 1967 for the Chicago One show, created by a young designer named David Burke. David Burke went on to do a lot of really interesting design work. And in fact, one of his pieces is kind of our connection between our first two exhibitions at the archive, because our next exhibition, which is on protest graphics, includes the book Right On, which is this amazing cheap paperback book that he designed, kind of documenting the protests that were happening in colleges in the late 60s. So David Burke makes an appearance in both of our exhibitions in this way. But this is to give you a sense of just this massive explosion of styles that happened all within about a 5-year period, 3-year period, actually. And Mary Goldstein, sorry, I misspelled that. There should be an L in there. VGC also claimed to have the first back in 1966 with her design, Harry. And actually, you could call this the first one that's more directly related to Beyer, because it doesn't have these breaks, these kind of stencil breaks that Berko and Blimpo and Pump and ITC Bauhaus had. Harry went on to inspire a bunch of other styles. If you want to see more of these, they're all on Fonts in Use. You can go to the related typefaces and see just the massive explosion of Bauhaus-related styles. And it's amazing to see how often these were also used in that time period too. As soon as they came out, they were super popular. So that wraps it up. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, and I don't know if there's time for questions or not, but thanks to Rob and Henry Cole Smith for curating the show, doing a lot of beautiful writing that I used for this. April Harper and Ian Ginger took all the photographs of the specimens that you saw and the Bauhaus work. Dan Reynolds for his amazing work on the history of German type. Florian Hardvig for helping me identify a lot of these typefaces, and then everybody at Fonts in Use for making type research easier. I use it all the time. I contribute to it, but I also use it a lot. Lucy Parker and the publishing team for making an amazing catalog. Sarah for hosting, and Laura for feeding me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. There is one question that somebody snuck in. Do you want to try to give it a shot?
Sure.
Okay. So did the Bauhaus own any of its any of the metal typefaces shown, or were they mainly relying on typefaces owned by local printers? And if they were, how did that affect the design layout process?
Yeah, well, my understanding is the things that I showed you before the Dessau location was opened and the print shop was opened there, those were printed at local printers, and maybe some other publications were as well. But they did have their own print shop by 1925 when Dessau opened.
And one little follow-up, has Beyer ever commented on the success of all the derivatives?
Yeah, I would love to know that. It's a good question, Kevin. I haven't read any interviews about that, but it would be interesting to know. I mean, especially since his own typeface was not, you know, the serif Beyer type for Berthold wasn't that popular. I bet it irked him because he was active designing into the 60s. He probably was aware of these. I can't remember when he died, but I'm sure he saw these kind of blow up on the scene.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stu. And thank you everybody for joining us. This has been just an incredible like whirlwind of information. So thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.
It was fun. Bye-bye.